Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Hello and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson. I have entitled this podcast, Facing Rejection, or in some way, shape, or form, I'm going to talk about it so that you can deal with it. Because rejection comes in all kinds of ways. It could be a rejection from when you were a kid, you didn't get picked for the team, somebody didn't accept your proposal, you got rejected from the credit card company when you filled out your application, or maybe a job, or in the case of when we're talking about relationships, it could be someone that you might have a longing for and how you get that gut check. Meaning you put yourself out there, you're being vulnerable, and in some way, shape, or form, you kind of get this, no, it doesn't quite work for me. However it comes, it definitely has a feeling where you have this sense of, oh, okay. And, we react externally all kinds of ways. Some of us can put on a smile, and some of us react. A lot of people feel like, well, get the reaction out now, put it out there. And people like myself, let me take myself, for example. I'm fairly diplomatic. So whenever the rejection came, and believe me, I've had plenty of rejection in my life. When it came, I tried to make the other person feel more comfortable about rejecting me. Now, that might be an odd thing to say, but I have to figure that if someone is rejecting you, it has to be fairly uncomfortable for them also. And having those kinds of individuals in my life that I've chosen, let's say, to be interested in, romantically interested in, and for it not to work out. Now, it might have even been a situation where you tried it for a little while and things just didn't work out. I've had those. You've gone out on a couple of dates and the other person's just not feeling you. Either you're not too tall enough or you're not big enough, not enough muscles, whatever the rejection is, too big, however it is, it happens. And that feeling of not being good enough, it hits you right in the gut. And sometimes you don't know what to do with those feelings. That is one of some things that we deal with on a continual basis. Some of us have developed a healthy way of facing it, and you've had rejection so much, it just sort of rolls off your back. Sometimes it's a lot of the same thing, and I'll give you an example. Let's say an actor goes out, they do an audition, they don't get a call back. Actors are used to something like that. That's just part of the business. And it's really interesting how, we see actors as being really self-absorbed. Well, sometimes they are that way because you have to have a really tough exterior in order to survive certain kinds of things. And yeah, it may make them a bit self-absorbed on the outside, but I'm just giving you the average. They're still human beings, and they deal with the rejection on the inside. On occasion, we've heard about the famous actor who was really shy, but the minute the camera is on, man, they've got their lines, they're really powerful, they're giving a dynamite performance, then the camera goes off, then the actor goes and hides in the corner because of their shyness. I've seen that kind of thing, and it's really an amazing transformation when the person is able to be on. They sort of become like an enigma. Because, wow, there is this whole different person because they take on a persona. They take on that character. Well, in your own life, it may not be that dynamic, but there is that internalizing that happens when you are rejected. And what does it do to you? Does it does it leave you with a feeling that lingers as if, wow, deja vu? I remember this when I was a kid. And, some people cry at the rejection. Sometimes we have a whole lot invested in whatever it is we're putting ourselves out there to want, and then it doesn't happen. And love is one of these things that does it to us. You could have a really strong draw to want to be with someone, and because relationships are about partnerships, it's the give and take, and you have to please them, they have to please you. There's that whole dynamic that happens in a relationship, and that's something that we may not think about at the outset, but it's part of the business of being in relationships. It's the give and take, it's the communication, it's the wanting to share stuff. And then that person just sort of cuts you off and doesn't even give you a chance to be the whole you. But the whole you is being rejected. I know how that can really stop people in their tracks. And it so often can change your perception of the world. It has such an impact on your emotion. Some people get very depressed after rejection. And like I said, some people, it just bounces right off of them. But to those that feel that sense of depression or that tightness in the throat, that all of those physical things that happen to you when, what do I do in this very next moment now that they've said no? I know a lot of people who imagine rehearsing their rejection lines. I can be honest with you. I was a person that did that. I used to rehearse that when I got the rejection conversation from someone, like I said, remember how I mentioned some people tried to make the other person who rejected you feel better because they had to reject you? I used to do that. I was so used to rejection. Now, funny that I would take that on as well as anything else, but I just kind of felt that it made the situation, at least when it went that direction, a lot more doable. Because I didn't want people to feel pressure to be with me if they didn't want to be with me. Therefore, by rehearsing that rejection thing, it made that awkward silence or that stare that happens in those moments a little easier to bear. Then I could step away from it, turn away, and I think at the time, here was something else, and you learn this when you're young. Because when the rejection thing happens and when your kids are young, then you don't want to get talked about because that just seems to make the hurt linger on and on and on. Now, as we get older, we've probably experienced that in different ways, so we have other ways of dealing with it. We have a much tougher skin. But when you're a kid, you don't want to be remembered as the person who got rejected all the time. So it seemed like the easy thing to do was to create this sort of dialogue that sort of let it filter away and, talk about the weather for a moment and use a distraction. And by doing that, then it would just make us forget about the fact that I was very vulnerable and put out there that I wanted your attention exclusively and wanted you to like me the same way. And what's your response? I mean, I remember as a kid, we would write notes and pass the notes, and you check the box, yes or no. You'd make the yes box bigger, make it easier to find, that kind of thing. But that's what we do as kids. So we carry those ways of operating far into the rest of our existence. Sometimes we don't get past all of those kid things that we used to do, even when we're grown up. Isn't it amazing how many childlike things we still do as grown-ups? Because we haven't really rethought about how I want to be now. And I want you to give that some consideration when you are thinking about this whole subject of rejection, how you handle it, how you reject other people when the occasion happens, because I'm sure you've been on both sides of that. And by us doing that, we're going to put some teeth into this whole thing about what rejection does to you and how you can process through it and still be whole at the end of it. I'm going to take a break and we'll be right back. Stay tuned.
GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast gives you advice on everything from hair to fashion to skincare products. We'll talk about the latest trends in makeup, hairstyles, and anti-aging remedies. And we'll cover all of the newest fashion trends. If you have an interest in or questions about the beauty trends that might work best for you, the Golden State Media Concepts Beauty Tips Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Hello, welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast, and I'm talking about rejection. So the thing about rejection is, it cuts to the core of us, because think about how we were brought into the world. We were brought into the world being hugged, having our needs met, being cuddled, being given a lot of reinforcement about things, and that's how we are taught to view the world, that the rest of the world wants us also. Over time, we tend to select our friends, people that we want to be close to, and they give us validation. And then sometimes we expand our circle. Sometimes we get a stage or a football field or baton twirling. We get to be the star of the moment. And that reinforces our feeling of importance. Now, when somebody comes along in our experience and doesn't reinforce that, that can be a bit difficult to take. At first, sometimes we're not even sure it's happening. It might happen very boldly. It might be said in a really firm way, and you kind of get the message right away. Or sometimes it can be really subtle, and you're just not able to read the signals. And adults seem to be able to do that. And some of it is diplomacy. So it's not outright rejection, but it is sort of done in a really soft way. And I'm going to call that a diplomatic way. But going back to as a child, and I'm talking about rejection on that level, when you've had a lot of reinforcement about your importance to the situation, the circumstances, you're the center of attention, and then let's say you're the kid that doesn't get picked for the team, or you're the last one to get picked. And, sometimes, kids are cruel. They pick on the last one or the person that didn't get picked or something to that effect. And you get spotlighted in a way that feels like, wow, everybody's singling me out, but this isn't in a really good way. This is a way that makes me feel like I'm not important. That kind of rejection. And as you get that in adolescence, see, that feeling happens in the gut. People looking at you, pointing at you, and that image just plays over and over in your head. And it can really, really affect you unless somebody comes in and helps reconstruct how you're going to remember that moment. Let's say if a well-thinking adult comes in and changes that moment, changes the impact that has, then you're left with that. And like I say, kids can be very cruel. They say out of the mouth of babes. Sometimes it's very honest, but sometimes it's very hurtful. And, where you fall on that spectrum really sets the stage for how you're going to deal with this going forward. And if you get opportunities to shine in other ways, maybe it might help fix that. But if you don't get that reinforcement, if you don't get those new memories or those new opportunities, fresh opportunities to create a different memory, then you have those painful memories about rejection. And in our own sort of way, we can fantasize about how we want things to happen. And even tell ourselves, because we've created this way of padding the impact of these things, we can become very delusional about what people are telling us in those spaces of rejection. So, for example, and this happens a lot of times in romance, where someone may be the object of your attention and you're really trying hard to impress that person, so much to the fact that you may be a big turnoff. And this person says, in a nice way, because maybe they're starting out being diplomatic, they say no, they're not interested. And you might take that as, oh, I just have to try harder. Because, what's one of the things that you're told as a kid? That if you don't succeed at something, then try harder, you'll get better at it. So, you take that bit of information and plug it into a situation like this, and, you might go overboard and become a little bit of a stalker because you're pushing the situation. And that makes people reject you even harder, even more. And you're fighting that internal thing that says, wow, I should run. I mean, I feel bad. I'm, being told no and so on and so forth. But now what do? Do you keep trying harder because there is something in your programming that says if you try harder, you're going to be successful? Or do you stop? Do you quit? And this is that thing about rejection where it's really hard to know, do you use the brake or do you use the gas pedal? This part about rejection, about respecting other people's boundaries, really gets to the core of, okay, what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. Respecting somebody saying no is an important thing to learn. Maybe the person who said no did it in such a nice way that, they didn't mean it. But how do we respond to that? A lot of people keep trying because the no hurts too much to want to yield to that. So they keep pushing. That's not necessarily a good idea because then we're not respecting other people's boundaries. But then go to the other side of that, whereas if you stop and hear the no, hear the rejection at the first instance, then how do you respond to that? You stop. But what does that do to you at that moment? Again, if you didn't get coaching early on in life about how to handle those moments, these are real important pieces of information in our upbringing that we need. We need to understand how to deal with rejection, when it's personal, when it's not personal, how to respond to it. Because remember, the thing that I did in my life is I tried the diplomatic approach. I mean, for my own sake, that when somebody rejected me, I made up all kinds of stories to make it something that it wouldn't get talked about later, to try to, okay, let's just erase our memory. That part worked for me for a long time, even well into adulthood. When I say worked, I mean it's something that I did. It wasn't necessarily a successful way to resolve my issues, but it was just something I did to get out of those uncomfortable moments. And I think a lot of people take that approach because we don't necessarily want to have a big upset with somebody. Let's say you might be romantically interested in somebody who decided that they just wanted to be friends. Well, you don't want to make that situation uncomfortable anymore, so you try to diplomatically, rewind the tape, put out the memory eraser so that we can just go back to where we were before all of that. Well, that's an interesting thought. But then think about those situations in which people tried to be boyfriend and girlfriend, and then it didn't work out. Well, in those cases where it was a mutual choice, then maybe you can both decide where you're going to go with it after that. But if it was one person was more interested than the other, then yeah, it could be a little awkward. And, it's that kid in the schoolyard kind of thing. You're being singled out and you're being ridiculed. Yeah, that kind of hurts. Think about that for a minute. Has that ever happened to you? But I'm going to take a break, and I'll be right back after this.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Hello there. Welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm John Johnson talking about rejection. So I mentioned how, this whole thing gets started. As kids, we are brought into the world, our needs are being met, and we are told how important we are. We're cuddled, we're loved, we're given the center of attention. And then as we get out there into the world, we start running into circumstances in which we don't have any control over, and we interact with other people. And we bump up against their needs and their wishes and their desires, and they don't necessarily match with ours. Sometimes there's negotiations that go on and it works. We can find some common ground and we go forward from there. Other times there is just complete no, there's nothing that works. And when you're on the receiving end of the no, there is obviously a reaction. Just as if on the other side of that, when you are accepted, you feel elated. But when the reaction is, or the response to you is no, that's a negative response, then there's the gut check. It's like, okay, well, where do you go from here? You don't get to go off into the sunset with your friend because they've said no. You basically have to do a 180 and go back where you came from. And that's not something that we're all used to experiencing. And there's the awkwardness of when you grow up, the adolescence, people form groups, and if you're not a part of that group and you're trying to become a part of that group, then you get rejected not by one person but by several, and that can be devastating to you emotionally. And if you haven't learned a way to deal with what that whole thing is about, whether you fit into that group or you find another group of people that you can fit into, when you are moving along as an individual vessel, it takes years and years of growth and experience and learning and experimenting and trial and error to be able to get this into a way that actually serves you. Because remember, when we start out with the idea that the world centered around us. We are the center. And then when we get out there and start dealing with other people, Other people have the same concept that we have. They think the world is centered around them. And these things collide all over the place. Sometimes it works and we find common ground. But when it doesn't, and it hurts in a lot of different ways, especially when we start talking about relationships and we want to really be with someone and they don't want us. Sometimes it happens very early and you don't get into the history of something that you may have had with them. Let's take a relationship that's been together for a while and then it ceases to work. There's a rejection on that level. I haven't talked about that yet. But that hurts a great deal. Because for a while, the agreements were in place and you were doing things together, things that mattered. And then there comes a point in time when it's not working and you split. Now, in many, many cases, I've talked about communication and how to keep things going forward. But right now, I'm talking about facing rejection, facing that idea that this is no longer going to work. And how do you hold yourself together during that period of time? Because if you're used to relying on that idea about how important you are, now when you're feeling rejected, you really come face to face with how important you are not. And the things that people do in these moments, some of them are very destructive. Some people turn to drugs. Some people turn to alcohol. Some people turn to behaviors and things to help dull the pain that they experience at a time like this. And it does, and moments like this always bring up something from the childhood. I mean, you may not consciously remember that exact moment. I mean, some people do, but it's that feeling. And however old you are, you've been feeling some sort of rejection for a long time. And all of those things it's like a freight train. There's a car every so many feet. And then when that thing stops, all of these things come colliding into you at the same time. That's that feeling in the gut when everything hits you. That's what it feels like. Some people can manage that very well. Like I say, they've had opportunities to learn from people about what rejection really is. Sometimes rejection has nothing to do with you personally. It has nothing to do with you personally. But if you don't understand that, then you do internalize it and you do very destructive things. I mean, I wish that everyone had the perception that when it's really about you and things that you need to work on, because sometimes people will reject you because you've done awful things and you need to change your behavior, that you could change it. But when it's times that it's not something about you, but it's really about the other person, I wish you really had the opportunity to see that at that moment and not be harmed by the non-acceptance at that moment. Because again, you're learning to know that it's not about you is a very, very powerful tool at times like this. And I say tool because that's something that's got to be in your box of thoughts, of things that you process through in moments. Because if you've been tracking the situation, maybe the other person has been going through a lot of stuff and they are just not at a place where they can take on what it is you want. And they're in survival mode. See, that's not about you. That's really about that other person. And when you have the capacity to see things from that place, from like a bird's eye view, if you can imagine yourself being a fly on the wall, watching this exchange, watching this conversation happen, or maybe be in the other person's head, and maybe they love you to death, but they just don't have the capacity to be able to fill your needs at the moment, and they have to try to survive. Those things happen too. So it really requires some thought ahead of time, and empathy, I think, is a big thing that helps people transition moments like this. Because if you can imagine what the other person is going through, even though you're being rejected, this borrows a little bit from something I did a long time ago as a kid, but I imagine what the other person is going through. And maybe they do feel something for you, and they don't know how to express it in a way that is mutually beneficial, but they just can't be there at this moment right now. Again, that's a part of life. And there's so many variables in that experience. But know something about this, that these moments are transitory, meaning that experience is happening at this moment, but we will transition this time period, and there is something worth living for after this. We may not know it at this very second because that rejection just, like I said, it hits us like a freight train. But you survive it. You get through that experience. And then we think about it a little bit later on. And if we're having difficulty processing this, and it is quite difficult to process rejection. That's why I'm kind of talking about it now. For those of you that have wondered about that or have had trouble with that, that's why I kind of framed it the way that I did, thinking about your childhood, bringing all of those kinds of memories forward and seeing how that shapes your behavior. And then I gave a lot of examples about how rejection happens in the experience on both sides, the person feeling rejection and the person who is doing the rejection. Because there's an experience on both sides. But the fact that, like I said, it's a transitory moment. You get through this. Sometimes it means you're just going to have to go find a quiet place and be with your thoughts for a little while. You may even cry. That's okay. Do that. Get some rest. You get up the next day and know that you've survived. And it might be some more processing that you've got to do. Write down your thoughts. And it'll help you be at peace with yourself. But you should always know that you're loved. You can love yourself. This is a good time to be a friend to yourself. I'm John Johnson. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.